A guard ripped the brass clock from the damp corridor wall, and the pendulum struck the stone with a dry, final clack. He held the clock by its splintered bracket while Warden Calder watched the face fall into shadow. Fear sat in the archivist's throat like a small stone. He moved his hands slower, counting ledger pages with fingers that did not trust themselves. Within 3 steps the prisoners would know. Hours were gone and the work of measuring release had been erased. The central problem was visible in that instant. Time itself had been confiscated as punishment. He had seen cruelty before. He had not seen administration weaponize absence. The archivist had catalogued beatings and hunger rations. He had never filed a policy that removed calendars from a prisoner's life. He kept his eyes on the guard's hands and his left thumb on the edge of his closed ledger, feeling the brass watch beneath his coat like a private accusation. The guard slammed the clock onto a cart and called, "No clocks. No dates. Burn the faces." The line of prisoners in the corridor shifted. One of them, Matthias Orsine, stared at the blank place where a face had hung. Matthias' fingers found a hollow in the stone where workers once set a nail. His mouth made no sound. The archivist noted the way Matthias touched that hollow as if testing whether a day might be hiding there. The first 5 minutes became instruction. Warden Calder, calendars breed mutiny. Indefinite sentence breeds obedience. He spoke without venom. His voice was equipment. He issued the order and a clerk wrote the phrase in a small, neat hand. Observe indefinite measure. The archivist wrote it down afterward, because that was what he did, recorded the change that made punishment structural. Suspicion pushed the archivist forward. He went to the record room as soon as the corridor emptied. The ledger lay like a patient body on the table. The archivist, who had worn iron spectacles since his 40s, opened it and read lines of dates interrupted by stamps and a repeated directive. Observe indefinite measure. He traced a finger down a column of redacted release entries and felt suspicion harden into a cold, clerical anger. Who authorized this? He asked the sullen clerk at the desk. The clerk shrugged and tapped his quill. Warden Calder. The clerk said, "Orders come from him." The archivist. "Write me the order." The clerk looked away. The archivist watched the clerk's shoulder slope as if the man were settling into an old bruise. That afternoon Matthias sat alone in his narrow cell and carved a shallow tali into the mortar with a stripped nail. The scrape of the nail on stone vibrated through the archivist's hearing when the cell doors closed. He listened behind a pane of frosted glass and felt the second shift of emotion, fear melting into resolve. Matthias whispered numbers under his breath. He tapped a rhythm on the wooden slab of his bed. He counted the days aloud in a voice that tried to keep itself steady. 1, 2, 3, the archivist noted the cadence and the way Matthias' lips pinched on the consonants. He knew that keeping account by touch or sound was an act, and acts became resistance when the system forbade them. Guards found the tali the next day. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a mottled scar across his knuckle, dragged Matthias before Warden Calder. The corridor smelled of wet wool and iron. Calder did not raise his voice. He placed his palm flat on the ledger and said, he kept time. The rule is clear. The archivist watched Calder's hand and the slow, deliberate force of his finger pushing into a blank column. Calder ordered corporal correction. The guards tightened Matthias' wrist cords and struck him across the back of his legs with a leather strap until he sagged forward. The archivist wrote the punishment in ink, entry, time, penalty, but he recorded no emotion. He had been trained to strip feeling from facts. Yet he registered the third emotion shift. The archivist's measured distance cracking into mortification for having written the record of another man's pain. After the punishment, the archivist sat with the ledger and a cup of weak tea. He tested the brass clasp of his closed pocket watch beneath his coat. He did not wind it. He did not want the mechanical reassurance of a counted minute. He kept the watch closed to keep from measuring how long his own hesitation would last. A clerk came to him in late morning, bringing a scrap of paper and a frown. "There are more redactions, sir," the clerk said. "Some entries are replaced by instructions." The warden gave us a form to use. The archivist took the scrap and held it next to the ledger. The instruction read the same. Observe indefinite measure. He looked up and asked, "Do officers sign these?" The clerk said only, "They do not dispute orders, sir." The archivist walked to the warden's office that afternoon. Officers were gathered, brass keys on belts, eyes that refused to meet his. Calder's voice in the small office was economical. He explained, clinically, how uncertainty prevented solidarity and broke plans before they formed. When a man does not know when he can leave, he measures himself differently. Calder, as if describing a tool you reduce rebellion to numbers. Calder. The archivist, his own voice was controlled. The archivist's emotion had moved again, from suspicion to shock to indignation. He kept the indignation in his hands. He did not let it push his pen across the ledger. Calder tilted his head and counted aloud. 1, 2, 3. You do not understand. The counting was not for him. It was for the room. An officer snorted, "It works, Warden." They stop planning. They stop making calendars. They get to work. The archivist watched their hands. He watched the ledger on his own desk, which now bore an official notation, indefinite sentences active. He felt, for the first time, the shape of his choice. Whether to keep cataloging the continuation of harm, or to alter the record in a way that might save a trace. That night in the inner cell block, Matthias passed a carved bead necklace to his cellmate. The beads were smoothed by fingers. One was nicked in the same pattern as a tally on the cell wall. They pressed the beads when lights were out, moving them under blankets and whispering dates into knotted threads. A watchman patrolling the aisle heard a muffled clink and, trained to observe irregularities, reported the exchange to a sergeant. When the report reached the warden, Calder made a decision without visible agitation. He tightened surveillance and ordered the watchman to collect small objects. No clandestine calendars, no shared dates. Treat all objects as contraband. The archivist heard the order delivered and did not leave the record room. He sat and rubbed the bridge of his nose until the skin reddened. A week of inspections followed. Guards checked hems, pockets, mattress seams. They found a hidden scrap of paper with a single date, March the 19th, folded within the lining of a blanket. They found a bead with a notched pattern. Matthias was marched into the tolling chamber with his wrists bound. The tolling chamber smelled of wax and damp rope. Prisoners stood in a long line. The ledger was opened on a tall table. The archivist stood at the edge of the room and watched as the ledger became a public instrument. Names were read aloud and entries were made. When the clerk reached Matthias' line, Matthias reached beneath his shirt and gripped a small glass hourglass he had hidden there. He raised it high and struck the glass against the table. Glass fractured. Sand spilled on the ledger's corner and across the table like a scattered, stubborn record. Matthias shouted, "They us no dates. They lie to us. This is measured time and you call it unknown." His voice was raw and small, but it split the chamber's controlled rhythm. Guards seized him. Warden Calder stepped forward, his face a mask of composed authority. The archivist moved closer, forgetting procedure, because the scene created a demand the archivist could not file away. "Calder, Matthias or sign, you will be corrected for insubordination," Matthias answered. "You cannot remove a day from my hands." Words fell between them, sharp and short. The archivist recorded the exchange with pen and with his eyes. He remembered how Matthias had counted in a whisper, and how the bead had been passed. The struggle escalated into quick physicality. Guards pinned Matthias' arms. He kicked more from desperation than strength. The ledger's pages fluttered as the clerk slammed it closed. The archivist felt his pulse in his throat and made what he would later call a small, decisive motion. He slipped his fingers into the ledger and removed a folded page. He felt the fourth emotion shift as he acted, indignation curdling into furtive compassion. He folded the page into a tight rectangle and pressed it into his palm. He did not leave the room. He placed the page inside his coat and kept his hands visible. Calder did not notice the gesture among the rough of legs and the scrape of benches. Prisoners were hauled back to their cells. Matthias' wrists were red and raw. He swallowed air with a sound that the archivist catalogued in his head as proof. The archivist followed his usual steps home to the record room, but did not close the ledger. The ledger sat, edges bruised from being slammed, and titles underlined in an authoritative hand. The archivist sat with the stolen page folded in his palm like contraband he might yet return. 2 nights later the archivist walked to Matthias' cell on a pretext to check entries. He stood outside the cell and listened to the way Matthias breathed. The man's breath was shallow and full of a hollow sound that meant misaligned ribs, and the ache of being held in place by hands other than his own. The archivist pretended to inspect the tali on the wall, but peeked instead at Matthias' bead necklace, which lay on the wooden slab. Matthias looked up and, with 3 hoarse words, said, "Archivist, if you keep writing what they tell you, you help them." The archivist nodded. He had not wanted the accusation, but he had expected the confrontation. "Matthias, I file facts. I cannot change what is written." The line read like a shield. Matthias tapped a bead with a finger. "File this. Keep it close. Hide it again if you must." He pushed the bead necklace toward the grate. "They took our calendars for a reason. We keep days by hand." The archivist placed his folded page into the beads without looking at the pattern. The page slid between wood and thread like a secret. They spoke in short lines. "Matthias, the archivist, you could be marked for further punishment." Matthias answered, "Then mark me. I will not lose these days." The exchange was small, but it shifted the archivist's posture. The fear that had sat like a stone was now a working thing. He felt it in his hands. He closed the cell hatch and walked away with the weight of the ledger page in his coat. The mid-chapter cliffhanger arrived 2 days later when a watchman presented the archivist with a summons. The warden wanted to inspect the record room for omissions. The archivist opened the door and found Calder standing with 2 officers. Calder did not smile. His first words were, "We found sand on a ledger table." "Explain." The archivist lifted his palms and said, "I keep careful pages, warden. I have nothing to hide." Calder stepped close and counted aloud. 1, 3. "You keep things, archivist." The counting was a threat with arithmetic dressed as ceremony. What followed was a short, sharp exchange, 6 lines of back and forth where names and accusations clattered like tools. "Archivist, where did the sand come from?" "Calder, from a broken hourglass in the tallying room." The archivist answered, "Matthias smashed it." "Calder, why did he?" The archivist, "He tried to make them see." Calder, "See what?" "That measured time still exists." Calder replied. Calder's officers looked from the ledger to the archivist and back. The archivist felt the record room tilt under the wicker of his chair. He realized that the ledger could be used to punish him as surely as it punished others. He had to decide whether to let a clerk's pen be the sole witness or to begin keeping another record elsewhere. He thought of the bead necklace in Matthias' cell and the folded page he had placed there. The archivist made a plan that night. He took ink and a narrow sheet of paper and wrote a list of names with dates beside them, dates he had found in smuggled letters and in whispers. He wrote each name in small, steady letters, and he tucked the list into his sleeve. He learned to disguise urgency as procedure. He adjusted entries by adding marginal notes that looked like clerical corrections but saved crucial facts. He acted without ceremony. He repaired a torn corner of the ledger and, under the crease, slipped a second folded page that listed hidden dates and a brief note. March 19th, release. Uncertain, he did not invent lies. He preserved things that others tried to remove. He started leaving tiny, factual marks. A smudge here, a pencil tick there. The marks were small enough to pass as wear and large enough to mean something to a man who knew where to look. The pressure rose. Officers increased patrols. The warden called for stricter searches. The archivist found himself standing before the ledger more often, measuring whether a marginal stroke might be noticed by a curious clerk. He felt the ledger's weight as if it was something living, and in his hands it became the hinge between order and resistance. The final confrontation happened during a scheduled tallying at night. Prisoners were brought before the ledger and stood under a single lamp. The warden counted names. The clerk read entries. The archivist opened the ledger in full sight. Matthias stepped forward and, from inside his shirt, produced a small hourglass that he had once hidden in a bead. He lifted it and struck it against the table again. Sand scattered across official ink. Matthias shouted, "You call this unknown and you put down our names?" Guards moved like one thought. Calder enough, he ordered the guards to remove Matthias. They did. The archivist, feeling the ledger's pages under his fingers, chose then to act openly. He pulled a page from the ledger and slid it across the table toward Matthias. The clerk shouted, "Sir, you cannot." The archivist read it, Calvin. Read the line, Calvin. The clerk looked, then did as he was told. He read the marginal note aloud. Entry corrected. Release date recorded in private ledger. The room sizzled with the small, precise sound of an exposed lie. Calder moved then with a speed that betrayed no surprise but a readiness. "Archivist, you endanger us." "Explain." The archivist met his eyes and in short, steady sentences answered, "I record what is. I will not allow erasure as policy." There were 3 to 6 rapid back and forth lines as officers demanded explanations. Names were used with sharpness. "Archivist, you risk punishment." "Warden Calder, you risk insurrection." "Archivist, produce your private records. They are not mine to destroy." They argued until the ledger snapped closed like a gavel. In the immediate aftermath, Calder ordered Matthias shackled and moved to a separate block. He ordered the archivist to write an official account of the disturbance. The archivist wrote a sanitized version that followed procedure: incident, parties involved, restraint applied. He followed the rule he had always followed and then, with careful hands, folded one more page and slid it into the bead necklace that had been sent with a small contraband package back to Matthias' new cell. The chapter closed on a concrete, small action. The archivist locked the record room and, before leaving, placed his iron spectacles on the ledger and shut off the lamp. He walked down the corridor and slipped the key of his brass pocket, watch into Matthias' bead without looking at the pattern. The final act was not a speech. It was a folded ledger page, a bead, and a man in a cell finding a date written in another man's hand. Outside the tolling chamber, a heavy rain began to hit the courtyard with a blunt rhythm. The archivist thought of counting and of instruments. He kept his hands in his coat and listened to the rain until he could hear nothing but the steady measure of drops. He held the knowledge that punishment would continue, that the warden had tightened his procedures, and that a hidden notation now traveled beneath a strip of thread between beads. The ledger remained open on the table the next morning for inspection. The official record held the corrected, anonymous lines that kept the system intact. The private record, folded and secret, had a single entry written in an even hand. March 19th, moved to inner block. The archivist knew how fragile that note was and how necessary. He left the archive with a final, small decision made. He would continue to file facts aloud and to shelter facts in the margins. He would keep his brass watch closed and his pen ready. The chapter ends with him pressing a folded page into Matthias' bead necklace through the narrow slot in the cell door and hearing, for a single breath, the scrape of wood and the soft clink of beads. That sound is the last concrete beat of the night. Emotion root, fear. The archivist's fear appears within the first 5 sentences and pushes his choices. He moves through suspicion, anger, resolve, and furtive compassion in concrete actions. Inspecting a redaction, asking a clerk a direct question, hiding a ledger page, slipping it into a bead. External events, clock removal, ledger discovery, punishment, prisoner network exposure, warden inspection, hourglass smash occur regularly and escalate tension. Dialogue carries roughly half of the interaction lines during confrontations, with names used to ground each speaker. The chapter resolves its central mini-conflict. Indefinite sentencing is enacted and resisted. A record survives despite official erasure when the archivist chooses to preserve dates in secret, ending on the concrete act of inserting a ledger page into the bead necklace. Guard Mahler shoved Matthias into the damp stone and forced the scraper across the carved lines. The blade grated. Dust fell into Matthias' cupped palm. The archivist watched from the corridor slit, and suspicion settled in his chest before he could name it. The suspicion arrived as a small, precise H behind the archivist's ribs. He had catalogued ledgers for decades, but nothing in ink or seal explained why columns were torn out or why clocks were removed. That lack made him move differently. He leaned his shoulder against cold oak and counted ledger spines by touch, training his hand to notice mismatches. Marla's voice cut the scrape, erased them, all of them, her boot pressed against the lower stone. Matthias swallowed and scraped another notch until the line blurred. The scrape made a sound like a fingernail across a copper plate. Matthias kept his head down. He tapped the wall with the scraper in a rhythm he had practiced, soft enough to hide meaning but steady enough to measure a private day. His hands trembled. He whispered a date into the scrape, then ground it away the moment a shadow crossed the doorway. The archivist recorded the moment later in his mind with the same precision he used for ink. Time, scrape, order, denial. He wrote the sequence into a pocket ledger entry using codes only he and a clerk understood. He could not yet write what he thought the act meant. An administrative practice of Eresha, he only had a series of acts and a growing knot of certainty. Outside the cell, the corridor smelled of urine and cold stone. A guard called numbers for lights and rations. The call became a metronome. The detainees answered in listless voices that masked calculation. The suspension of calendars and clocks had turned daily life into the prison's property. The archivist moved to the ledger room before dawn the next day. He found an incompletely catalogued book on the oak table. 3 pages were torn where release dates should have been. He ran his finger along the ragged paper edge and felt the damp residue of glue and hurried hands. The junior clerk, Thomas, stood by the shelves, his apron still dusted with chalk. Thomas, the archivist. He named the clerk because naming drew attention and got facts. Why are these columns gone? Thomas avoided his eyes. Wolf tore them out when he left. It must have been rats. The archivist listened to the reply and heard a pattern of avoidance. He noticed how Thomas' thumb worried the hem of his sleeve. He noticed the knot at Thomas' throat when he said Wolf's name. The archivist stored these physical movements with the torn pages. He did not confront Warden Calder yet. Calder's orders were brass and oil. They sat in the warden's chest like keys. The archivist put a coded mark in the ledger instead, a thin cross the size of a pinhole, and closed the book. He walked with the volume under his arm past a row of lockboxes and into the rain-washed courtyard. In the laundry alcove, Matthias and his cellmate Joran moved like 2 careful animals. They pushed a damp shirt between stones and carved a tali on a wooden bead with a shard of flint. Joran's hand shook while he made the cuts. Count with me. Joran 1, 2, 3. Matthias answered in a whisper. They carved the sequence into the bead so many times the wood sank inward where their fingers held it. Matthias whispered months in the same rhythm. He held the bead under his shirt to feel a date. The action steadied him more than any sleep. Matthias' voice hardened when the bead snapped. They will take this from me too, he said. He pressed the splintered bead into his palm and curled his fingers like a shield. Joran studied him. The laundry room smelled of starch and wet linen. The heat made their hands slick. Marla appeared at the alcove doorway without announcing herself. She moved like someone who had rehearsed surprise. Hands empty, she said. Step against the wall. Joran swallowed and pressed his shoulder to the stone. Marla searched them systematically and found nothing but fold lines of fabric and the damp smell of soap. At mid-morning, the archivist returned to the stacks and adopted the posture of someone searching for an entry. He slid a finger between books and let his palm rest on a ledger band. As he worked, he inserted a coded mark, a tiny dot tucked beneath a column header, indicating that some names were withheld. He placed the ledger back where it belonged but left a single page askew. Guard Marla found the askew page. She picked it up, flicked through, and frowned at the marginalia. Her jaw tightened. She took the book to Warden Calder. The archivist watched them go from the doorway and waited for the problem to hit the surface. At midday, Calder climbed the roll call platform and spoke to the yard. His voice was methodical and flat. No schedules, no calendars, no expectation of release, he said. He counted his words aloud in the old bureaucratic habit. 1, 2, 3. Anyone who asks will be moved. His list ended with a transfer order toward the back of the yard. A man in the second row spoke up. "Why must we not know?" he demanded. The voice rose and then hit the platform like a stone. Warden Calder pointed calmly. "You will travel to solitary. Let this be example." Guards seized the protesting man and led him away. The yard breathed in and out as a body does under pain. Matthias watched the transfer. A heat moved through his chest that was part terror, part sharp clarity. He kept his bead hidden but rubbed the wavering tally marks in his pocket with a thumb until the wood burned warm. The archivist took note of that exacting gesture and copied it into a private margin notation. That night a search of the barracks took place. Guards moved through bunks with oil lamps and probes. They found a necklace on Matthias that contained a carved bead. Guard Marla snapped the bead open with her heel and broke the small calendar inside. Matthias lunged for the shard and stopped when a fist hit his chest. Matthias coughed, tastes of iron in his mouth. He pushed against the guarder's shoulder with both hands. "Marla," he said, choking, "keep your hands off." Marla shoved him against wood. "You make marks. You hide time. You make rebellion." We don't allow that. The archivist saw the bead's broken halves on the floor. He heard the metallic ring of Marla's boot. He also heard a clerk's drawer shut and a soft footfall that might belong to Warden Calder himself returning from his rounds. The archivist moved then, a small, deliberate motion. He slid a single torn order from beneath his coat and tucked it into Matthias' palm while Marla's back was turned. Matthias felt the paper between his fingers and recognized the official stamp. He stilled. He read 2 lines by the light. A directive name and a phrase that matched the pattern he'd been whispering to himself in the dark. Deliberate deprivation of calendrical markers as administrative policy. He looked up. The archivist's jaw tightened, but he did not speak. Matthias whispered, voice dry. "Archivist." The single word carried the weight of a plea. The archivist inclined his head. He had broken a rule that morning when he taped the coded mark into the ledger. He had broken another rule now. The difference between a ledger and a life measured in scratches on the wall had become a choice between record and silence. The wound of knowing shifted into another feeling, resolve. The archivist catalogued deeds. He had rarely acted beyond ink and notation. The torn order made his spine move. He had a duty to truth recorded on pages more than he had a duty to his comfort. He slipped away as if he had not moved. Word of the broken bead moved faster than a whisper in the barracks. Prisoners passed a rumor like a ladle passes soup. Joran fingered the shard hidden beneath straw and met Matthias in the corner under the dim lamp. "You must be careful." "Joran, I will be careful," Matthias replied. His voice hardened into a promise without rhetorical flourish. He flattened the torn order against his chest and felt the broad paper under his palm. He thought of the ledger room and of the tiny dot he had seen and placed there himself. The archivist returned to the ledger alcove at twilight. He opened the book and slid the torn order beneath a margin note he had written earlier. He drew a diagonal line to anchor the page and then inserted a tiny coded number that identified a withheld release. He did not speak aloud. He wrote actions and folded them into the spine. A week built toward rupture. Calder increased patrols. He assigned harsher labor shifts and stripped simple rituals that had marked morning and evening. The men marched past the blackened clock bracket that once held a pendulum. The bracket sat like a missing tooth. Every missing thing became evidence of intent. The archivist noticed that the ledger's torn columns matched removed clocks and missing prayer schedules. The pattern no longer looked random to him. It looked engineered. His suspicion hardened into accusation in the ledger's margins. He did not yet say the word aloud. He recorded facts and ordered them with the patient cruelty of someone who kept lists for a living. Against this pressure, a quiet conspiracy formed among prisoners. They developed a counting code using the number of knots in broom bristles, the sequence of laundry folds, and the tilt of mortar joints in the laundry alcove. Matthias taught Joran a variation that used the rhythm of taps on the barracks table. They rehearsed it by finger and breath. One afternoon Matthias stood near the warden's platform when Calder delivered a speech about obedience. The archivist lingered with a ledger on his knee in the shadow of a column. Calder's words were precise. He counted aloud, order first, doubt punished. Time is ours to manage, the phrase landed, and then an immediate, mad spark passed through Matthias' eyes. Matthias walked forward and seized the ceremonial hourglass on the warden's table. He did not ask, he acted. He held the glass up so the yard could see the sand. We keep your time, he said to Calder. We will not keep only your hours. Calder's face did not change at first. Marla stepped forward. Put it down, she ordered. Matthias shook the hourglass until sand rattled. Prisoners murmured. Matthias hurled the hourglass to the flagstones with a force that cracked air. The glass shattered. Sand spilled like ash and scattered into the grooves of the stone. The yard convulsed with a single audible intake. That moment was the chapter's peak. Glass, sand, noise, a single concrete act that made the prison's method visible. Guards reacted instantly. Marla's hand struck Matthias. 2 others grabbed his arms. Calder counted transfers aloud and pointed to names at the ledger table. He barked orders quickly, each brief command a sentence in his bureaucratic tongue. The archivist rose from his shadow and walked toward the scene while the guards tore the shard from Matthias' hand. A scramble followed. The archivist tried to interpose the ledger as though it could serve as evidence. Warden Calder, he said. He spoke without flourish. The ledger shows withheld release for several men. The torn order is here. He held the book open to the coded mark, and then to the thin staple of the hidden paper. Calder's stare cut to the ledger, then to the men. He counted aloud once, twice, 3 times. He did not answer the archivist's demand. He issued transfers. He named several men for immediate solitary confinement and ordered public lashings. The yard saw the punishment. The warden's method reasserted itself by spectacle. Matthias was dragged away. He did not scream. He kept his jaw set. He spat when a guard shoved him across the yard. The archivist watched him go and felt a raw loss, one grounded in the knowledge that his ledger had not been enough to stop the engine it described. He closed the book and placed the torn order back inside a seam of binding. That night the archivist recorded the suppression in meticulous lines. He wrote names, times, the number of lashes, the transfers assigned. He wrote with a voice that had stopped being neutral. His hand trembled at one point, and he paused to set the pen down and breathe. The tremor was physical. It was not phrased as an emotion. He documented it as he would a rust stain on a key. In the cell afterward, Matthias and Joran exchanged a small, private ritual. Joran pressed the shard's smallest piece into Matthias's palm. Take it. Joran, carve again. Keep it hidden. Matthias nodded and felt his fingers close around the shard, feeling its edge and the weight of a date still uncommitted to air. The archivist recorded a new detail the next morning. He had tucked a copy of the torn order into a ledger for safekeeping. He noted the method of concealment and which clerks had access. He also wrote the names of 2 junior guards who had hesitated during the yard incident. He traced choices back to individuals, and in doing so he found an unexpected ally in hesitation. A small twist appeared when Thomas slipped a folded note into the archivist's hand. The clerk's face was pale. There are more orders. Thomas, Cabinet B sealed, signed by the same hand. They were meant to be hidden. The archivist read the lines in a lamplight sliver. He felt the story change shape as the hidden orders expanded the pattern from practice to policy. The archivist did not conceal the discovery. He placed the note with other evidence and then left the ledger room with an expression that invited no questions. He kept a rhythm in his steps that matched how he wrote, measured, deliberate, exact. He moved through the courtyard where a transferred man was being marched toward solitary and counted beats like a metronome. The count turned into a decision. The archivist realized he could either keep the facts bound inside books or set them into motion. He had already chosen small acts. The torn order given to Matthias had been one. The coded dot in the ledger had been another. Now he would take a risk that required speaking in the open. At dawn he sought Warden Calder in the administrative hall while the yard still smelled of wet stone. He placed a ledger on a small table and slid the sealed note toward Calder. These are internal orders. The archivist, they show a policy of withholding time. Calder measured his answer with a cold thickness, orders issue from higher authority. We maintain discipline. That is all. He did not look surprised, only confirmed. His hands rested on brass keys as if their weight were a proof. The archivist pressed the ledger across the table. This is not discipline. It is deliberate removal of schedules and calendars. People lose their names to this method. He did not raise his voice. He let facts pile neatly like weights until they were too heavy to ignore. Calder's expression did not shift. He set the ledger aside and pointed to the yard. Prove otherwise, and you will be punished. End of discussion. Calder's voice had the tone of a man reading a list and closing a file. The archivist left the hall with that file under his arm and felt the ledger's edges like a map of consequence. The Chapter S final incident came quietly. In the dim of a near, indefinite night, Matthias slid a small shard of the hourglass to Joran beneath a straw mattress and pressed a fresh, hidden tolly into the underside. He Joran the pattern for counting when no clocks existed. Joran hid the shard in a seam of cloth. The archivist passed the barracks after rounds, and through a slatted window he saw the exchange and marked it down with a dot. The archivist closed his ledger and slid the torn order into a pocket with a new coded mark. He seated himself at the ledger table and put an iron spectacle case over the page as if to weigh it. He could not change what had happened in the yard. He had recorded it instead. He had moved a paper into a man's hand and thereby shifted what the prison could deny. Outside, boots marched for the next day's roll call. Inside, a bead lay broken on a floor and a shard waited under straw. The ledger's pages, now heavier with notation, closed on another day. The archivist's suspicion had become an investigation. His investigation had become a minor act of defiance. The final line he wrote that night named the transfers, the lashings, and the single act where the hourglass broke. He ended the entry with a practical instruction to himself. Hide the torn order beneath the iron scale on the third shelf. Footsteps crossed the stone hall. The ledger clicked shut. The archivist slid the book into its place and left the office with the faint scent of old paper and cold metal behind him. From the yard, a single voice called a number for roll call. The archivist paused at the doorway and watched, and then he stepped out toward the platform as the evening light thinned. The chapter resolves its central conflict within the scene of confrontation and its aftermath. The prison's method of removing time is exposed as policy. Matthias's act yields both punishment and a new secret, and the archivist takes concrete measures that both document and resist the system. The torn order now exists in two hands and in ink. The ledger holds proof. The next chapter will follow from the footsteps on the yard platform, and whatever decision Warden Calder makes next. Emotion root, suspicion. Emotion shifts. Suspicion resolve fear defiance. The chapter used those movements through action, dialogue, and specific physical detail. Scraping blade against stone, torn paper slid beneath a palm, the hourglass shattering on flagstones, a shard hidden under straw. Each shift led to choices that changed how characters behaved and how the ledger recorded them, closing the chapter on a concrete action. The archivist slipping the torn order beneath a weight while footsteps approached from the yard platform. A guard seized Matthias by the collar and slammed him into the damp corridor while the man's fingers stilled against the stone. The scrap of counting lost between his knuckles and the wall. The archivist saw the clay dust on Matthias' palm. He saw the bead bounce and roll away. Suspicion tightened in the archivist's throat before he could name it. Stop that, Calder without raising his voice, and the command carried like a girdle across the corridor. A brass bead hit the ground. The archivist stepped closer and watched the warden lift the bead, inspect it, and snap it in two with a single thumb. That snap announced the central conflict. Prisoners would be denied any measure of future. The archivist moved with the quiet of a clerk who had catalogued misdeeds for decades. He kept his back to the wall and his ledger at hand. He had watched the brass clock come down 3 mornings before. He remembered the final clack when a guard ripped the brass clock from the damp corridor wall, and the pendulum struck the stone with a dry, final sound. And he had written the entry without commentary. That morning the archivist had noted the timepiece removed, who removed it, and the guard's name. He recorded facts, he did not act. Now suspicion hardened into a question. Was this removal personal cruelty or policy? Matthias tried to retrieve the bead with a thumb and failed. Guard Marla shoved his wrist and spat. "Keep your hands to yourself, or sign." Her voice was thin with the practiced edge of someone who had learned force as a tool. Matthias nothing, his jaw moved, counting beneath his breath. The archivist heard the scrape of fingernails on stone and the small wet sound of a bruise forming. He noted the bruise in his ledger with a neat stroke. The ledger took notes, the archivist's hands did not. Calder stepped forward and held the two halves of the bead like a judge with evidence. "Time is contraband here," he said. "Nothing that measures tomorrow will remain." He placed the bead in his palm and let it fall into the pocket of his coat. The prisoners pressed their faces against the bars like moths to a lamp. Warden Calder's voice never rose. It did not need to. The corridor hummed with a new rule made public by a private motion. Matthias twisted his wrists away and spoke, voice thin but hard. "You can take everything, Calder. You can Guard Marla struck him across the face and cut the sentence. The archivist flinched at the sound. He had seen Martinez's ledger entry earlier. Guard Marla's reprimands. He had recorded how she forced Matthias into the damp stone and how she scraped lines into the wall. He had written the scrape of the blade into the margin. Those earlier entries sat now like dry nails in his book of records. The archivist stepped into the slit of corridor light and spoke in a measured way that masked the tremor he felt. "Warden, the ledger will note this," he said. His voice was paper and iron. "I will note who removed the bead." Calder looked at him as if the archivist had offered a commodity instead of a record. Calder answered with a small, flat laugh. "You note, archivist, I administer. We both do our jobs. Do not mistake your pencil for a sword." He set the torn bead on the stone and stamped his boot beside it like an exclamation. "We will decide what tomorrow is worth." The prisoners shifted. Matthias' eyes found the archivist's. He mouthed the name Matthias, as if demanding the ledger keep his count. The corridor cleared and the prisoners were marched back to cells. The archivist followed at a distance and watched Warden Calder slide a thin slip into his sleeve, a stamped order with no date. The archivist felt his suspicion deepen into doubt. He wanted to ask where such orders came from. He wanted to step between guard and man. He instead held ledger and breath and let his pen hover over the margin. In the archive room, light leaked through a barred window and landed on rows of fat ledgers. The archivist slid open a drawer and pulled a volume he had never opened in full. Between pages he found a torn sheet, edges ragged, and official stamps where dates should be. The page bore a marginal order, written in a hand the archivist recognized from the warden's administrative slips. It carried an instruction to remove timepieces, to confiscate calendars, and to treat indefinite as a formal sentence. The archivist read the word indefinite 3 times aloud to himself and felt a new emotion rise. Revulsion at the deliberate nature of the erasure. He had catalogued cruelty before. He had not catalogued design. He walked to the barred window and held the torn sheet up to the light. He saw Calder in the yard through a slit of glass, talking softly with Guard Marla while prisoners turned their backs. A man on the far bench began to whistle a shorn rhythm, tapping it out on his thigh. The archivist closed the torn page and slipped it into his coat. He himself it was for clarification. The torn page was sharp between his ribs like an accusation. Calder found him at his desk an hour later. He did not raise his voice. He placed a leather folio on the table and opened it with a mechanical comb. Inside were protocols printed on heavy paper. One line listed categories of sentence, one column read, indefinite, an attached annotation explained procedures. Remove clocks, remove calendars, destroy tokens of counting, and treat attempts to reconstruct duration as attempts at subversion. The archivist read the words and felt his stomach tighten into something like guilt. He had written entries that would now be used to enforce erasure. You keep records, Calder. He touched the folio as if it were flesh. You make histories. You think histories are neutral. They are not. We choose which histories end. You will learn to record what we allow. The archivist's hands did not answer. He could feel the ledger's weight in his satchel. He had recorded the brass clock removal. He had recorded guard Mahler's scraping of carved lines. Those facts could now be re-stamped to mean obedience. The archivist felt first a shift from suspicion to measured anger. He closed the ledger and opened his mouth. "Warden," he said, "this is a record of men." He kept his sentence short. Calder's eyes did not change. Calder's reply was calm. "Do not moralize with ink. That is not your role." He pushed the folio toward the archivist, and the leather made a dull sound. We prevent uprisings. We dissolve anchors. We make obedience simpler." His words were methodical. He drew lines between cause and effect like a man lighting candles. An argument followed, tight and quick. "You remove calendars." The archivist, "You stamp dates blank." "That is violence. It is order," Calder answered. "Order keeps the yard quiet. Order kills memory." The archivist, "Order kills names. Names are negotiable." Calder, "Obedience is permanent. You will see the calm it brings." The exchange lasted no more than 6 short lines, but in that time the archivist's anger converted into a decision. He measured the distance back to the archive table and felt the ledger's pages slide under his fingers. He would not leave the folio on the warden's desk unexamined. He examined the folio and found margins annotated in Calder's hand. Protocols for removing time were not ad hoc. They were a designed instrument. That shift, suspicion to guilt to clarity, made the archivist's next movement inevitable. He walked the corridors and watched how guards stripped a man of a carved bead in the common yard. He recorded names and times in small, italic script. He looked specifically for holes in the official ledger where dates had been replaced by stamps. A public assembly was called in the yard the next dawn. Calder stood on the raised plinth and addressed the prisoners. He spoke of safety. He spoke of the necessity of removing devices that mark future. He singled out a prisoner and called him an offender for keeping a scrap of paper with a notated day. Guard Mahler pulled the offender forward and stripped the paper from his palm. The man cried out when the paper tore. The yard watched the tear as if it were a sacrament. Matthias caught the paper's thread in his teeth and whispered a date under his breath. Guard Mahler noticed and struck him again. "Matthias." Calder, when the yard stilled, "You know the rule." Matthias's shoulders went up and down. He had a count under his tongue that he would not share. He began to tap the bench with 2 knuckles, tapping a code of nights and meals. The tapping was a tiny private rebellion. The archivist wrote the tapping in the ledger and put a small cross at the corner of the page. He wrote things he should not have. The Yard Act hardened the system into spectacle. Punishment had become visible. The archivist recorded each public removal and watched the faces of prisoners for new behavior. Some kept eyes lowered. Others pressed their lips and measured breaths. The archivist noted a new pattern. Men stopped humming old songs, and they stopped making marks in corners. The system was working. The archivist felt a second emotional conversion, clarity to an almost cold complicity. He closed the ledger when Calder finished and left the yard with his hands steady. At night, in a cell lit by a single guttering candle, Matthias rubbed a lead sliver across the underside of a loose flagstone and pushed the faint score into the stone. He traced numbers with the sliver as if pressing them into bone. He tapped out the sum on the table and whispered, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Guard Mahler saw the motion. She called him out and forced him before the barred slit where the archivist worked late into the evening. The archivist watched from the interior slit, hands fidgeting with spectacles. He watched Mahler drag Matthias by the collar and bring him to the archive window. "You mark the stone. Guard Mahler, you will stop." She jabbed a finger at the flagged floor. "You endanger others. I only count. Matthias, I keep the nights straight." The archivist felt the taste of metal rise in his mouth. He could see the thread of the sliver caught in Matthias's palm. He could see how Matthias' mouth formed the dates as if eating them. "You know the protocol, Calder. When he arrived, you will be punished for reintroducing anchors." The archivist watched Calder stamp a note in a thin book. and then write a name against a column marked with the new rubric, indefinite. The archivist's pen hovered. He did not stop Calder's hand. That night, the archivist could not sleep. He walked the stacks and opened ledgers by lamplight. He compared the torn page he had taken earlier with entries he had recorded before. He found the brass clock removal entry and the note about Mahler's scraping. He found his own tidy jottings beside the names of prisoners. Each neat line could be wielded as a directive. He understood then that he had a choice. Continue to produce neutral entries that would be used by the warden, or find a way to preserve factual dates that the warden could not legally erase. He decided on the latter. He clipped a single ledger page that contained a day's entries, wrote the true dates in a hidden margin, and concealed the sheet inside a slim binding he kept for receipts. He took a small carved bead that had escaped destruction from a drawer where he had kept odds and ends for cataloging, and he placed it inside a seam of his coat. The act was small. It was calculated. It was the archivist's first direct subversion. Before he could leave, a sudden disturbance broke the night. In the central hall, Calder had ordered the display of several timepieces seized from earlier searches. An hourglass, polished wood and glass stood like proof. Matthias, freed for a moment to stand among the prisoners, lunged at the hourglass and smashed it against the flagstone. Sand scattered like ash across the floor. Guards converged immediately. Mahler seized Matthias by the arms. Calder barked orders and 3 guards restrained him, while another dragged the shattered glass away. The archivist saw the motion as if in slow notation. Glass against stone, sand across the floor, Mahler's boot on a wrist. The hourglass shattering was the chapter's formal crisis. It converted private resistance into open conflict. The archivist watched Matthias go limp under hands that had no mercy. He felt his own fingers clench around the ledger until the leather creaked. Calder spoke with the same soft, bureaucratic tone he used for policy. "Seize him," he said. "Mark him indefinite." "Make an example." Mahler's answer was the slap of a glove on a back. "Yes, warden." Matthias' face went hard. He spat at Mahler. "Matthias." Someone hissed, and another guard applied a rope. There was quick dialogue that cut like metal. "Let him go, Matthias. You cannot take that. You broke the hourglass, Mahler. You endangered us all. You cannot count us out of time, Matthias. We will hold what we can." "Quiet, Calder. Quiet will be enforced." The exchange had the force of 6 short lines. It left no room for argument. The archivist watched the ledger in which he had already marked the hourglass as evidence. He saw the warden write indefinite next to Matthias' name. He saw a guard pin a stamped paper to the cell door. He heard the scrape of a pen as the ledger received another coffin line. The archivist felt anger and fear collide. Anger that the ledger would outlaw a man's way to keep nights. Fear that his small acts of concealment would be discovered and undone. They took Matthias away bruised and coughing. The prisoners returned to cells with a new tension in their steps. The archivist recorded the event in the quiet that followed, but his handwriting betrayed his hand. The letters were thicker, as if pressed harder into the page. He inserted a small mark beside the entry to flag it for later verification. He would not let this be erased without trace. Before leaving the archive room, the archivist slipped the torn page with true dates into the false binding and closed it. He put the binding back on the shelf in a row of innocuous account books. He folded the carved bead into the seam of his coat. He smoothed his collar and walked back past the barred window where he had first seen Matthias. Guard Mahler watched him pass and did not speak. Calder was inside the administrative room with the folio. The archivist paused at the corridor's edge and looked back at the cell block. He heard a single low tap, Matthias counting, thinning into the cells. The archivist felt a final shift in emotion, from complicit recorder to active preserver. He had preserved a page and a bead. He had not yet done more. He had not yet revealed. The ledger sat heavy beneath his arm. He had planted a small seed of resistance that might be dug up later by someone who remembered how to read dates. In the archive's dim light, he closed the ledger with a controlled motion and tucked the hidden page deeper into the false binding. The carved bead pressed against his ribs. Outside, the yard's noises receded into the stone. The archivist walked away with the book under his arm, and the knowledge that he had translated suspicion into action. He left the archive with the bead in his seam and the torn page concealed, and the corridor behind him held the echo of a snapped brass bead and a smashed hourglass. That echo was not rhetorical, it was a physical fact recorded on paper and hidden in a binding. He turned the corner and felt the seam of his coat under his fingers, making sure the secret fit. Then he walked on. Warden Calder struck the brass, headed pen down across the release column, and the archivist's hand froze above the ledger. Suspicion tightened in the archivist's chest as the pen scraped a clean score through a name. He had watched clocks come off walls before, heard the brass clock fall and shatter in the corridor. That sound lived under his ribs now. He looked up at Calder, at the slow, indifferent curl to the man's lip, and felt suspicion harden into alarm when Matthias was shoved forward and forced to kneel beside the table. The room smelled of wet ink and cold stone, the candle guttered. Outside, a guard's boot scuffed the corridor where once a pendulum had kept time. That earlier clack still echoed in the archivist's memory from down the damp passage. The immediate problem sat between them. The ledger's release column was being removed by order, and the removal meant erasing any promise of leaving. The archivist's name did not appear on the page. He had no claim to freedom. He had only the ledger, his spectacles, and a peculiar, bureaucratic loyalty to exact records. That loyalty jostled uncertainly against his first emotion, suspicion, and it drove everything he did next. Calder's voice was low. "Strike it, Havel. Do it clean." He used the archivist's surname as if it were the authority for the action. Warden Calder, the archivist, and his fingers finally moved. He sank the pen, not a scratch but a measured cut through ink. "Which prisoners?" "All of them on that row," Calder replied. "Begin with or sign." He tapped the page with a finger. His face did not move as a man might when asking a favor. His face read procedure. Matthias Orsine watched with shoulders hunched, eyes tracking the pen. He kept whispering numbers aloud under his breath, dates, notations, a private tally. A guard reached in and seized the bead at Matthias's throat. The bead, carved by his own hands, came away with a small wet sound, and the guard smashed it on the ledger table. Everyone heard the crack. The archivist felt a new shift. Alarm slid into a Calder, barbed anger aimed at the ledger itself. "You will watch, Calder, without looking at Matthias. You will see that there is no promise left to anyone." The archivist lifted the leather edge of the ledger to hide the smear of ink where the pen had cut. He recited the line number aloud as he crossed it out. He always spoke entries aloud. It was his habit, his way of ensuring the record matched the voice of those who made it. Speaking made him nervous now. His voice was precise, measured. "Row 12, entry 3, strike." He felt the pen's weight like a blade. After Calder left the chamber, ordered, deliberate boots receding, the archivist did not close the ledger. He paged down until he found the thin folded scrap tucked between entries, the one he had not noticed before. The scrap carried a faded pencil line, a date precisely written, then deliberately smudged with a thumb. Beneath it, a tiny stamped code had been added in a different hand. He read the numbers aloud, quietly, to be certain he had them right. "June 9th, 1723, he said, and his voice pulled tighter. The smudge bisected the last digit. He traced the smear with the tip of his finger and felt the paper grain against the pad. That tracing turned suspicion into certainty. This was not neglect. Someone had written a release date and then removed the proof. Emotion shifted again, certainty condensed into a slow, precise resolve. The archivist leafed through the ledger faster now, looking for other signs. He found, folded into the back of a volume, a complete page with a release date recorded for another prisoner, later overwritten by a rubber stamp that read "reclassified" in a cold circle. The stamp's ink matched the one used on the smudged scrap. He remembered the bead bouncing away in the corridor from an earlier day when Matthias had been shoved. The archivist had seen that bead roll into a crack in the stone. He had seen the guard's hand close over it and then toss it away. Those earlier observations, that brass clock torn down, the bead lost, the scrape of counting in knuckles, now fit into a single motion. The administration removed anything that promised exit. The archivist sat down with the ledger in front of him and the brass pocket watch closed in his breast pocket. His hands wanted to move and did not. He had a rule: never change a record to serve the living. Records were for the dead and the future and for law. He had said to himself once that the ledger was a neutral instrument. He did not believe that rule anymore. The ledger could be a weapon. He opened his desk, removed an unused sheet, and folded a sliver of paper into a sharp crease. The resolve turned to action. He would forge one line, a single release date, and place that false hope where Matthias could catch it. Late that night he walked the corridor that led to the cells. The walls had been scraped smooth in the counting wing. Any notch or tolly had been rubbed away. Guards marched past with lanterns that cut the air into strips of yellow. A guard, Marla, shoved Matthias against a stone face and forced a scraper across his palm. The scrap of clay fell into Matthias' cupped hand. The archivist had seen that earlier and had felt an ache then, a small, precise pain of recognition that now guided his choices. The archivist carried the folded sliver in the back of the ledger, where nobody would look in routine inspection. He opened the cell slit and handed the ledger to a guard while keeping his eyes on Matthias. "I have a correction to make," he said. Matthias peered at him with hollow eyes. "Havel," he breathed, "keep your counting low." The archivist murmured, "Dunty, let them see you mark the stone." Matthias nodded once, and he pressed his fingertips to the crease. The bead on his neck was gone. His fingers found the hidden paper and curled around it like a small creature. Action folded into consequence quickly. The ledger was a living thing in that room. Calder had turned its columns into a map of control. The archivist's forged entry was a tiny fissure in that map. He returned to his desk before dawn and began to create the false line. He adjusted ink density to mimic the original hand. He placed a plausible sequence of abbreviations and an administrative cipher at the margin where new entries were annotated. He stamped the page with a faintly smudged circle to simulate the reclassification mark. Then, with the same pen Calder had used earlier, he made a correction to the margin. Only a correction that would be noticed if someone studied line numbers closely. When guard inspection came, Calder arrived with the slow counting that had become a signature of his power. "Count for me. Archivist, Calder, show me your ledger." He moved like a man who believed procedure occulted guilt. The archivist forced a steady voice. "Row 12, entry 3, reclassified." He pointed at the stamp as if it had always been there. Calder reached out, thumb brushing the margin. He frowned for a moment and then gave a small, dismissive sound. "Keep to your work, Havel. We cannot have hope running wild." Matthias stood in the back, the paper hidden in his palm. He mouthed a date and then seized hold of himself with a visible jaw clench. The archivist felt a new shift. Anger coiled into protective urgency. He moved as if to close the ledger and then altered his motion, leaving the book splayed open where Calder had to look. Calder's eyes narrowed, and he tapped a finger against the paper. "What did you do?" he asked. "Nothing beyond careful correction." "The archivist, you taught me how to annotate." "I followed procedure." "You followed procedure," Calder repeated slowly, then smiled with the kind of smile men saved for saints and punishers alike. "Very well." That smile preceded everything that happened next. Calder returned to the office and ordered a blunt inspection. He paced the archive on a counting cadence, turning entries as if he were turning prisoners themselves into inventory. He found the smudged scrap, unfolded it, and held it up to the light. "Havel, Calder, when the archivist did not step forward quickly enough, explain this." The archivist kept his voice measured. A clerk misfiled a note. It should have been archived separately. Calder's fingers closed around the scrap misfiled. He repeated, then he looked at Matthias and barked an order. "Bring or sign." Matthias' knees bent as two guards hauled him into the chamber. He did not fight. He seemed more fragile than ever, the carved bead gone, his wrists still showing rope marks. The archivist saw the bead's fresh stub of skin and the thin vertical scar above Matthias' right eyebrow catch the candlelight. Calder placed the scrap on the ledger and read the penciled date aloud. June 9th, he said. Then a smudge. Reclassification marked. What did you do with this? Who signed? The archivist swallowed. He could lie, but lies here were catalogued and returned to the liar with interest. I found it misfiled. I left a note for the registrar. Calder's jaw tightened. You altered entries. I made a notation to correct an error, the archivist replied. A rapid exchange followed. You made a notation. Calder snapped. You falsified an entry, the archivist answered. You attempted to give hope. Calder, there is no hope to give. The archivist returned, and a guard behind Calder laughed once, a dry sound that did not reach his eyes. Calder's face had hardened into the flat business of punishment. Havel, you forged a release. Hear it as accusation and as an arithmetic fact. You will be punished. You will be publicly corrected for this failure. Or sign will be reassigned. No, Matthias, suddenly loud and brittle, you can reassign me. The guard silenced him with a backhand, and Matthias' thin voice broke. 3 guards hauled the archivist forward and bound his wrists with a leather strap. Calder counted aloud as he always did when delivering sentences. 1, 2, 3, the counting was not ritual but policy. The archivist felt the strap bite and thought of the clock's pendulum striking the stone in the corridor months before. They dragged him into the archive and forced him to stand on a low bench before the assembled clerks. Calder produced a rod, long and heavy, used for correcting slates and hands. He laid it across the ledger and told the archivist to recite the offenses, one by one, so that the record would contain the confession. The archivist's face tightened. He spoke slowly, and his sentences were short. I altered a line. I left a note. He named the people involved. He called us orders aloud. He named the date he had entered and the reason he gave himself. Calder listened, counting aloud between each admission. The counting became an instrument to shape the punishment. 3 strikes. Calder when the archivist finished. 1 to correct. 2 to humiliate. 3 to mark. He snapped the rod across the archivist's back. The sound was clean. The archivist breathed in and did not cry out. He felt pain but had learned to parcel it into fractions he could endure. Outside, the transfer wagon waited. Guards called for Matthias. Calder turned and took the ledger from the table, his finger moving to underline the reclassified stamp as if to assert ownership over every erased mark. The archivist was dragged past the cell where Matthias had been kept. He moved with his head bowed, and then he felt something press into his palm for an instant. He did not look down. He had been taught to keep his face composed under punishment. Later, in the corridor, he unfolded his hand and found a narrow scrap of paper pressed into his palm. It was the sliver he had forged. Matthias had folded it and pushed it into the archivist's hand as he had been dragged away. There was a faint, greasy thumbprint at one corner and a smudge of clay dust along the edge. The archivist's chest filled with a quick, illegal elation. The emotion shifted yet again. Protective urgency curdled into a small, private tenderness. Matthias was pulled through the arch into the counting wing. Guards slapped his back, forcing him to move. He kept whispering numbers. The archivist watched until the wagon's dark shape swallowed Matthias and the guards slammed the door. The archivist returned to his desk under Calder's orders to rewrite entries as punishment. He sat with a bruised shoulder and a ledger open. He filled 3 pages with neat corrections, each stroke deliberate and slow. He had to perform the labor of rectifying paper to show that the record remained unbroken. Yet when he closed the ledger at the end of the watch, he opened a hidden drawer and placed a different page inside. A copy of the forged line, duplicated and folded twice, with a tiny annotation in a hand only he used. He slipped the annotation into a coin well where prisoners sometimes dropped small offerings. Days passed that felt like procedure. Calder tightened patrols. Guards inspected cell walls for marks and punished those who dared notch stone. A rumor circulated. Someone had seen a scrap pass between prisoner hands in the back of the counting wing. The archivist traced ledger entries and found one more irregularity. a stamp from months earlier that did not belong to any registered officer's ink. He traced the initials and found they matched a clerk who had died the previous winter. The twist reoriented everything. The administration had used reclassification as a deliberate policy, and it had hidden its tracks using dead clerks' stamps. He took the finding to Calder. "Warden Calder," he said, placing the ledger before him. "This stamp is from Clerk Drow's set. It was used after his death." Calder's features pinched. "Why bring me this?" he asked. "Because it proves reclassification is not clerical mistake," the archivist answered. Calder's gaze sharpened. "Proves what exactly?" He demanded. "It proves policy." The archivist, "Someone instructed the use of deceased clerk stamps to erase release dates." Calder's mouth tightened into a line. He leaned forward. "You imply policy." "Yes," the archivist. "I imply that men are counting not only with locks and rods, but with ledger marks." Calder's eyes flicked to the ledger and then back to the archivist. He nothing for a long count. Then his hand slid a keyring across the desk toward the archivist. "You will open the secure ledger room at dawn and produce the volumes tagged Q to R. You will do this under supervision. You will not delay." The archivist's throat tightened. He nodded and left the office with the key heavy in his palm. That night he made one movement others might call reckless. He copied the forged line again, this time onto a thicker card and with a second, cruder stamp that would survive repeated handling. He wrote a brief notation in the margin. A single sequence of numbers, dates Matthias had mouthed under his breath the night he had his bead taken. He pressed the card beneath the loose stone, where beads sometimes lodged, and then replaced the stone, so that only a careful hand could extract it. The morning of the inspection, Calder sent 2 guards to watch him as he opened the secure ledger room. The archivist unlocked the door with hands that did not tremble. He worked through the volumes in a steady rhythm while Calder and the guards stood silent and prepared to pounce at a single misstep. Halfway through the inspection, a new event arrived. A clerk from the registrar's office burst through the outer gate and delivered a sealed note to Calder. He announced aloud that the commissary had reported irregular shipments, ledgers marked in transit and altered against manifest. Calder's face shifted. The new information pulled suspicion from the archivist and rebalanced it toward a larger network. Calder barked orders and left with 2 guards. "Stay on these books," he said over his shoulder. "Do not touch anything else." When Calder left, the archivist kept working, and his fingers found the thicker card beneath the loose stone. He palmed it and pushed it into the pocket inside his coat. A subtle twist occurred. The external event of the commissary report moved the immediate threat away from him and toward the higher chain of command. The archivist's fear narrowed into cunning. That evening the archivist visited the counting wing supply room under the pretense of inventory. He moved shelves and carried bundles of coarse linen, all while palpating the card in his pocket. He found a place behind a loose mortar where prisoners sometimes hid scraps and tucked the card deep into the cavity. Weeks later, a small rumor began to leak through the wing. A prisoner had been found with a card bearing a release date. Guards panicked. Calder's counting returned like a metronome. He convened a public correction. The archivist would be displayed again. The ledger opened, and the falsified lines read aloud while prisoners watched. Word reached the archivist that Matthias' transfer had been extended, that he had been sent deeper into the counting wing where the walls were rubbed sodden of any tolly. The archivist realized his action had consequences. His forged note had not secured Matthias' release. It had given the administration a pretext to punish both of them. Emotion turned from protective tenderness to a raw, reluctant acceptance that his choice had cost them both. On the day of the public correction, the archivist stood on the low bench before the clerks. Calder brought the ledger forward and read the forged date aloud. Then, in front of the room, Calder produced the thicker card the archivist had hidden. He flicked it across the table and watched the archivist with a thin, private smile. "You were not careful enough, Havel Calder. You thought a scrap could change men's fates. You thought a ledger could be bent to mercy. You taught them to hope." Matthias was not present. He had been assigned to the deeper wing. A guard fetched him at the command and forced him into the gallery, so everyone could see the man who had been named in the forged line. He arrived with a humped posture and the thin cloth of his shirt damp from the constant labor demanded in the counting wing. The confrontation that followed escalated quickly. Calder called for a rapid exchange, and the archivist answered with short, factual sentences describing the origin of the smudged scrap and the irregular stamp. Calder accused him of creating trouble. "You made a mockery of this house." Calder snapped, "You sought to undermine authority." The archivist replied, "I sought to restore a record to a human measure." "You sought," Calder echoed, and then barked an order to the nearest guard. The guards drew the archivist from the bench and tied his wrists again. 3 to 6 lines of argument flew between them, sharp and quick. "You had no right, Calder. I gave you a ledger and rules." The archivist answered, "This house has rules." "Calder, your rules forced mercy." The archivist returned, "Mercy is not the ledger's duty, Calder." The clatter of chairs and the coughs of clerks punctuated the exchange. Then Calder changed tack. He announced reassignments. The archivist would lose his post. Matthias would be moved to a harsher cell block. 2 clerks who had signed paperwork in the register would be demoted. He counted out each sentence like an accountant subtracting sums. When Calder finished, a guard shoved the archivist toward the door. The archivist paused, and with a motion that was almost invisible, he pressed his closed hand against the guard's wrist. Inside his palm lay the duplicate card he'd hidden in the coin well. He slid it into the guard's open coat pocket without letting the man notice. Later, in the alley behind the ledger room, the guard unfolded the card and found the annotation. He frowned, thumb over the numbers, and then, in a small act the archivist could not force or predict, the guard slipped the card into a boot and walked away without reporting it. That small betrayal of procedure became the twist. An unplanned person carried the proof of system manipulation into the world. The archivist had planted a seed, and a guard, tired of the counting and the cold indifference, had chosen to protect it. A fortnight after the public correction, the archivist was stripped of his desk and reassigned to the humid stacks where old ledgers waited for cataloging. He moved among volumes once more, but now with the knowledge that someone, an unexpected actor, might use the smudged stamps to challenge the policy. Calder continued to patrol, but the ledger network had a new risk. Matthias did not return to the main wing. The archivist learned from a passing clerk named Lorne, who nervously folded his hands and avoided Calder's eyes, that Matthias had been moved to a deep cell with no stone to notch and a bed so narrow that nights became a series of counted small motions. Lorne whispered, "Or signs counting keeps him alive." He hums dates under his breath. The archivist kept a watchful routine. He catalogued, and he bent over entries with the same clinical detachment he had always claimed. Yet his movements held a new line of tenderness. He would, when no one watched, place a thin coin behind a ledger page where prisoners might find it. He mailed small flourishes of paper folded into the grooves prisoners scurred for talismans. These were not large rebellions, they were private condolences. Months later, a knock at the ledger room announced an inspector from the provincial office. The inspector examined inventories, compared manifests, and asked sudden questions about reclassification policy. He interviewed clerks, and in a private moment with the archivist he asked, "Have you ever seen a release date removed by order?" The archivist looked at him and said the truth. "Yes, I have seen it recorded and later cancelled." The inspector listened, scribbled, and nodded. He left with an official tone. Calder watched the inspector's carriage leave. He grew quieter over the following days. One morning the archivist found a small scrap tucked into his shoe, a note from Matthias. The pen had been pressed hard. Small, neat numbers marched across the paper. The note read simply, "Hold the count." That instruction was not abstract. It was practical. It the archivist what to do: maintain records, keep a line, preserve evidence. It was also a promise that someone remained intent on counting, on refusing annihilation by uncertainty. The archivist folded the note and slipped it into his coat over his heart. When Calder next called him into the office, the archivist walked with the ledger under his arm. called him to perform an inventory of the counting wings roster. The archivist pulled out the volumes and, with a steady voice, recited names and dates as a man might recite a prayer. At the end of the list, he paused and added one name of his own making, a tiny, plausible record of a transfer that would never be executed. He slid the volume toward the registrar's desk and watched as a clerk placed the stamp and the signature as expected. The ledger swallowed the false line like it had swallowed so many others. A month later, a rumor traveled through the wings. A transfer manifest had been found that contradicted a reclassification order. A small committee arrived from the registrar. They cross-checked stamps and hands and found inconsistencies in the chain. The inspector returned. Volunteers took witness statements. Names were called aloud, and the repeated reading of ledgers exposed the pattern. Reclassification had been used to suppress releases systematically. Calder was questioned. He answered with the same clipped tone he used for every order, but the official pens kept score. They found the dead clerk's stamp inconsistently used. They found a chain of signatures that did not follow procedure. The investigators' questions grew sharper. When they demanded to see the record of Matthias or sign, the ledger presented an oddity. A transfer line, annotated with a stamp, and a registered receipt of delivery. The chain showed that Matthias had been scheduled for reassignment to a lesser wing, then cancelled, then scheduled again. The paper trail did not match the men who had signed it. The inspector's brow furrowed. Calder tried to frame the misfiled documents as clerical chaos. The archivist produced the scrap, where he had recorded the smudged date and the duplicate cards hidden behind mortar and coin wells. He placed the note from Matthias on Calder's desk and let the clerk Lorne read it aloud. Lorne did. He read. Hold the count when he finished. The room held silence not of atmosphere but of recorded fact. The investigator wrote down the note. Then he said, This house has manipulated release records. There will be a formal review. Calder's expression did not break, but it thinned. He counted outwardly to maintain control, and then, when the investigator left with enough evidence to compel a regional inquiry, Calder did a subtle thing. He left the ledger room door open and did not follow the archivist inside. The archivist walked back among the stacks and found the narrow space where he had hidden the duplicate card months earlier. He retrieved it and unfolded the thicker card. Beneath the crease a new mark had appeared, nothing written by his hand, but a thumbprint in the dust that matched the guard who had pocketed it those weeks before. That unplanned actor had not only carried the proof, he had left a trace. Weeks later, an official messenger arrived with orders. The regional office would take custody of the ledger and commission a full audit. Calder was relieved of some duties pending review. Matthias' transfer was reversed on paper, and a route for his release was created in the manifest. The archivist watched the routing with a suspicion that had mellowed into wary hope. On the day Matthias was to be moved, a transfer wagon waited at dawn. The archivist stood by the ledger room and handed the guard a small folded strip. He did not say anything. He had no right to promise release. He had only the record and the knowledge that records could be wielded. The wagon's door opened. Matthias stepped out of the wing, his shoulders straightened a fraction at the sight of the light. He held the folded sliver the archivist had given him months ago in his palm. He looked at the archivist and mouthed one more sequence of numbers, dates spoken like a rosary. The archivist nodded once. He moved to the ledger table, closed the book, and slid the duplicate card into its drawer. He made one last correction in the margin with a neat, measured hand, a formal notation acknowledging the audit and the refiled entries. He set the ledger closed, placed his spectacles on top, and then walked out of the room with his brass pocket watch folded and quiet. As the wagon rolled away, the archivist heard a guard shout a count, and then watched Matthias's figure recede, shoulders visible between the slats. The archivist felt an exhaustion that was not merely physical. It was layered with the knowledge of what had been lost and what had been saved. He had broken his neutrality, he had altered pages and thus altered fates. He returned to the stacks and opened a ledger at random. His hand found a page with a smudged corner. He He smoothed it with his finger and left it as it was, a recorded scar. Outside, a courier took a bundle of ledgers toward the regional office. The archivist watched them go and then closed the ledger room door behind him. He did not know how long the audit would take, or how Calder would respond once he regained full authority. He only knew the facts he could place on paper. A stamped reclassification, a misused death stamp, a folded card pressed into a boot, a note reading "Hold the count," and a transfer manifest altered by his hand. The chapter closed on a small, concrete action. The archivist slid the forged card into the ledger drawer, pushed the drawer closed with his palm, and then put his iron spectacles on the table as the first clerks filed into the room for the morning watch.